Okay, Phil Browning-Helsel here from Austin Seminary. Welcome to the second video on Dianne Crowther's book, Sustaining Persons Grieving Losses. So in the first video, I talked about the first three chapters: grounding care, sustaining persons in context, grounding pastoral care, spirituality and meaning, caregiving, a lived experience, and caregivers' journeys, themes and meanings. That's the first four chapters. And now we're going to start on the fifth chapter, Grieving Losses, The Long Goodbye. I should show you the book. Dianne Crowther, that's an Australian chaplain, long-time chaplain with experience in dementia care. And so this book, subtitled Fresh Pastoral Approach for the Challenges of the Dementia Journey. So she says that people are grieving losses and a long goodbye. And that's part of her gift to the field, is to challenge that grief theory that in grief you quickly move through a series of stages and then you're done with that process. And there's not one single pathway for grief in the kind of bereavement that she's talking about. This process involves accepting the reality, irreversibility, and meaning of loss, processing rather than avoiding pain, adjusting to the environment without the deceased person, adjusting the belief system and the sense of self in the world, and embarking on a new life, making space for other relationships through relocating rather than relinquishing the deceased. That's on page 101. So already you can see this as a new approach to grief. It's not just let go of the person and move on. It's finding a new place for the person. Long illnesses, stress, and lack of social support may impede this grief process. Crowther says, and she talks about dual continuing bonds in the experience of the grief. So the ways that you continue to be connected to the person even as you let go, and how grief involves a kind of cognitive restructuring, a kind of mental restructuring of one's life, acknowledging that affective pain also produces a new and meaningful life, where the bond continues internally. So her questions for a lot of the grief theory approaches, even the most current grief theories, is do these grief theories work when a lot of the loss happens before death? And she says, as in dementia, when a lot of the functional losses occur before death itself, she says that there's a kind of in a way, dementia disallows that grief process because it has to happen ahead of time. So it might be disenfranchised or not acknowledged in the way that you would want. So she quotes Pauline Boss, the expert in this area, who says that resilience in dementia care requires holding on to two opposing ideas at the same time. And she notices the risk of frozen grief when people face an ambiguous grief. Then they might have a frozen grief in which their central assumptions about God, the universe, their loved one, and other people are challenged, and then they struggle to remake a narrative that makes sense of their loss, their present situation, and their future. So this is really about caregiver grief. A loss that may be unidentified by others as a loss. And there's often, that goes along with changes in the caregiver's functioning that have to do with the demands of caregiving. She found three parts of grief: heartfelt sadness and longing, worry and isolation, and the burden of personal caregiving sacrifice. So persons with dementia still experience the emotional challenges of loss themselves. So end-of-life care includes these continuing bonds, kind of an ongoing response to the person who was, which is while not denying the person who is. So that's the part of the grieving work, that balance between the past and the present. And she asks again if our grief models, Kubler-Ross, William Worden, Niemeyer, are these models still pertinent when most of the grief happens before the death? And what kind of spiritual approach is practical then? Okay, that was chapter 5, really helpful work, grieving losses. And chapter 6, local pastoral practice. So there's a meaning gap for caregivers, which is really an opportunity for pastoral care. But she finds in her study of congregations in her area that not many people know what the dementia caregiver is going through in much detail. So she describes people, even people who have been very involved in the church, not having anyone check in with them, and the church is not having a plan to address dementia care grief ahead of time. And there's also the challenges of continuing to involve persons with dementia in their care. So in general, as she talked to pastors in Australia, she found that there were not a lot of people who were aware of the concerns of persons with dementia and their caregivers. And so there was an invisibility, small proportion of persons with dementia and caregivers in the congregation. Sometimes they dropped out, I think, because of the burdens of care. And no pastoral practice led to a kind of way to address those spiritual questions. And then no ecclesiology or no theology of the church that then flowed from the experience of dementia care. So that was chapter 6, probably one of the most discouraging chapters in the book. Chapter 7, theological foundations for pastoral care. Crowther finds that caregivers suppress their emotions in order not to overwhelm others. All of them indicated something of themselves was lost, as well as the person's identity. So they kind of didn't have a sense of anyone journeying with them. And there were few indications that there was that the clergy knew or was prepared to respond to this kind of particular grief. So she asks, why bother with Christian pastoral care? And she answers that question by saying there's a sense of the eschatological kingdom that's meaningful in this sense. Pastoral care is, especially for caregivers who are giving dementia care, is part of this larger challenge of a narrative within Christian hope. And the way the spirit and the body are connected means that we're required to care, but we're also kind of made complete in care. She uses Matthew 25 as an example of communities of empathic hospitality. That Matthew 25 passage where people are caring for others, but they don't necessarily know that they're caring for the presence of Christ. And she talks about Jesus' model of sacrificial friendship, including reciprocity, not hierarchy. So the real question she asks, I think a very profound one, is how does the church respond to deep loneliness? And she says the absence of preaching on grief, one of the most common realities in people's lives, suggests that the church ignores it. And she points to the Psalms as a site where all the feelings of life are represented: anger, disorientation, conflict between belief and experience. And that the Psalms, she says, are meant to inform our practices of our emotions. They're meant, like Psalm 88, which really expresses despair against God. And Job's question, church worship needs to change to emphasize happiness less, Crowther says, and instead provide spaces where inexpressible pain is shared, feelings of lament. So these central texts of the Christian and Jewish faiths can then orient us towards suffering and grief, because to avoid it is antithetical to the cross, Crowther says. So she talks about a model of kind of receiving Christ to comfort ourselves and then sharing it with others. And how indifference is really the more common response than we would like to admit and like to think. And how we really need a chance to experience our suffering in community with one another, since hope is something we do together. And she talks about the special part of the self that's shared in each of us, we're very much impacted by others, by our reputation or how others see us. We're social in a deep way. That social self that we experience through being with others and through others' appraisals of us and through how people talk about us, those spiritual selves need to be, those social selves need to be strengthened in a spiritual place, and the church is a place for that, where we can bear one another's burdens. So the church is lacking a response, she wonders, perhaps because it hasn't heard completely the stories of dementia sufferers and their families. And it needs to kind of foster a contemplative awareness in that presence. But she also thinks the fragile identity of dementia is part of the divine gift of identity. And she wonders, this was an interesting proposal, if we don't need a kind of ironic imagination for both sustenance and failure in our understanding of dementia care. And she mentions, just in passing, this notion of a hidden self in dementia care. So let's turn finally to chapter 8. She talks about a pastoral approach, and she says that she notices how Jean Vanier's approach in the L'Arche community was to help people experience God in community through supporting one another's growth. And L'Arche was a community for people with disabilities, and Vanier talks about people Crowther talks about how there's really no difference between our need to support dementia sufferers and caregivers. We need to give people permission for help seeking in dementia care. And the churches need to be truly present, including people with dementia in worship, and offering help, not just saying if you need help generally, we're here. So these are shared care partnerships rather than just being things done to a person. So again, this has to do with the tone. People can easily pick up on whether something is being done to them or whether they're an active participant in that process. So she suggests some important touchstones for working with people with dementia and their families: the time of diagnosis, anniversaries, and residential care entry are important moments, and they each require distinctive pastoral presence. So in those moments, there might be feelings of guilt and betrayal, of vows. Somebody who puts their loved one in a nursing home might wonder if they've betrayed their vows. But pastoral care provides a unique perspective here for a deep imaginative listening to the sparkling moments of a person's life, even in the midst of this despair. And she talks about parish nurse care as a potential resource here. So generally, Crowther has an indictment of pastoral care here as she says that pastoral care can be a strength as it runs counter to a fragmented, individualistic, task-oriented society. So there could be in that sense, we kind of only value what's hypercognitive and what's task-oriented and what contributes to the marketplace. Dementia care falls outside of all those categories. She talks about monthly programs, a caregivers group or respite group, and then shared worship and an annual memorial service with congregations. And then in the final chapter, moving forward, she really gives a spiritual framework for everything she's been saying pastorally. So for her, spirituality is the key area for connecting people with dementia to others and connecting caregivers to others. This is almost a book more about caregivers than it is about people with dementia themselves. And she uses this metaphor of the body of Christ, especially the 1 Corinthians 12 metaphor, to say that, and she says that if we've forgotten people, we have to kind of actively remember them into the body of Christ. And spiritual care for dementia care is a perfect place to do that. So I highly recommend Crowther's work, Sustaining Persons, Grieving Losses, a fresh approach for the dementia journey. And it really focuses on the lives of people who are caregivers. And uh, the it's such an important step. It's a fine-grained analysis. It looks at 6 caregivers and their journeys, and those caregivers' experiences are different based on whether they have family support or whether they're male or female, how much they reach out for social support. So Crowther shows that care for dementia is a body-spirit care, because the body comes first and the body continues in some mysterious way to persist even in an experience like dementia. But that journey of caregiving, especially when one is carrying many health burdens on your own, or many burdens of responsibility for others, is an especially painful one. And caregivers often ask themselves, "Why me?" And when it comes my turn, will I receive the same care that I've given? And people with dementia ask themselves questions like, "Who will I be when everything that I think and my ability to think is gone?" I believe that the church has a unique opportunity to reach out and care for people who are going through this particular journey, which will become increasingly prevalent in the next few years. But this is first requires, as Crowther calls our attention to, it first requires listening to the voices of caregivers and to their particular form of lament. And pastoral care is a uniquely powerful place to do that work. But it's also difficult work, and it requires not rushing in to fix things, and dwelling with the mystery, and accepting things that are outside of our control. So this is a wonderful book by Dianne Crowther, Sustaining Persons, Grieving Losses. I encourage you to use it. And I would especially recommend, if you jump around in books, chapters 3, 4, and 5 as kind of the emotional and conceptual center of the book. Thank you for watching this video, and I encourage you to persist in this important area of pastoral care.